Hello everyone, thanks for stopping by. Today we're looking at the high-grade Act Zaku Kycilia's forces. The Act Zaku is a design we first saw in Mobile SUit Zeta Gundam, but was slightly backdated to fit the Mobile Suit Discovery series. This kit is pretty different from the other Origin Zakus in that very few parts are common between it and the other Zakus in that lineup, due to the design being a bit of a departure from the standard MSO6. The kit went together quickly, typical of the Origin lineup. If there's anything that could be an issue, it's the lack of ankle mobility. The feet can't rotate as far forwards and backwards as your standard Zaku because of how the legs are designed. However, the leg and waist articulation are better than the standard Zaku since there are no power pipes on those areas. The mono-eye part does move with the head as well, which honestly needs to be standard. In terms of Zaku designs, this isn't my favorite. I think the chest is too bulky for the arms and legs. The normal Zaku shoulder shield and shoulder spikes do seem out of place, as well as the standard backpack. The head design is weird as well, being very long. And although this kit is nice for giving some variation, I don't know if it should really be called a Zaku. It's something I have to think about, and maybe I'll have an answer when this project is finished. This design is a bit of an ugly duckling, and I do prefer the Zeta Gundam version of the Act Zaku, but hopefully some paint will change my mind. I primed with Mr. Surfacer 1000 and then sprayed a coat of Tamiya TS42 light gunmetal. I'm starting off by painting some areas of the kit in a medium gray, as I am basing things off the Kycilia Forces colors. Although this is unintentional, the paint I use is an almost perfect match for the color. Normally, I start things off by painting the frame and other mechanical details in basalt gray, but I'm keeping a lot of these surfaces in metallic because I want some major contrast with the different painted surfaces. It's a method I've stopped doing, and I actually had to use one of my older Zakus as a reference. Now I'm using some of the basalt grade that I mentioned to paint some areas. I don't use it that much in this build, only on bits I think really need it, that being some of the joint covers, the neck area, and the backpack thrusters. This is also where I start to deviate from the Kycilia Forces colors. Although the plastic has a color that is a pretty decent match for basalt gray, I am using this paint on more than those plastic bits are, basing things off personal preference. I'm using a really dark gray for the main color. I never use actual black to paint black since I feel that's too harsh, and a dark gray like this gives off the illusion of black at this scale. In the past, I've used black gray, but I'm all out of that paint, so instead I'm using German gray. It's a perfect alternative to black gray, and the differences between those two colors is virtually non-existent. I honestly think those two colors are the exact same, just with different names. I think a really dark gray like this is actually superior to black. The usual rule regarding hand painting is that the darker the color, the easier to paint. But I think black is a little tricky to work with. It's also a color that's perpetually out of stock at my local shop, so German gray is a color that I can actually find. I'm painting the power pipes with the basalt gray I used earlier. I chose to paint these after the main color, so I wouldn't have to essentially paint these areas twice when doing touch-ups. I'm doing physical chipping with metal tweezers to expose the metallic surface underneath. This is a really fun part of my process, and it's one where very little thinking is involved. I just bounce the tweezers on the model surface to wear away the paint. The natural spring in a pair of tweezers is essential to creating effortless chips, which is why I prefer to chip naturally instead of painting them on with a brush, not to mention how much smaller and more in scale the chips are. I sprayed a coat of semi-gloss, and I'm painting over some of the areas of the model with an orange mixture. This year I've painted a few things orange, and this was the easiest shade I've painted so far. It did come with the usual problems inherent to orange, the main being uneven coverage, but that'll actually be an advantage for this project. I do use a large amount of this orange, and although this mixture is as simple as a mixture can be, I don't want two different shades. So whenever I made the final mixture of this color, I painted all of the orange surfaces again just to even things out. This was a color I had to build up with several coats, mainly because of the colors underneath. And at first, the color seemed a bit desaturated, but after 2 or 3 coats it ended up looking just as vibrant as it did when I was mixing it up. It's a really nice shade and one I'll probably use in the future. Now I'm just painting the rest of the model white, or rather a pale gray that gives off the illusion of white. Just like I don't use black to paint black, I don't use white to paint white. But why paint a kit twice, especially when I liked how it looked before? Well, it's because I want to tell a story. If you can't tell already, I'm repainting this kit in an Earth Federation color scheme. I wanted to show when Act Zaku, which was used by Kycilia's forces, then captured after the end of the 1-year war, and repainted in Federation colors to be used in testing. And those of you who know a bit of lore may recognize this color scheme from the Powered Gym, a test unit from Gundam 0083, Stardust Memory. Just like the orange, I'm not concerned if the white dries a bit patchy and uneven. If a little of the black still shows through, that's fine, since it helps tell the story I had in mind for this project. It also gives an impression that some of these surfaces were repainted a bit more hastily than others, while some spots were ignored that don't really matter, like the underside of the crotch joint. That being said, I'm not using this as an excuse to be messy. I'm actually being really careful, much more so than I usually am since there are so many different coats of paint on this kit. It's also why I don't apply as many intermediate clear coats in between the different weathering steps, and this was tricky because I had to use 2 or 3 coats of this paint. Although this repaint was what I had in mind, I didn't really like it at this point. I've briefly covered feelings like this in my Ashimar video, but this was almost the reverse. With that Ashimar, I felt that I wasn't able to properly paint the idea I had. With this, I was able to paint the idea I had, I just thought I had a bad idea in the first place. But just like the other times I've doubted things, I fixed things with chipping. Chipping these secondary colors was a little difficult because in a lot of cases I would work down to the metallic underneath. So to show the black and gray, I couldn't be as carefree as I usually am with physical chipping. I then added some decals off camera, just because I had to come up with the placement on my own from several Federation sets, and I wanted to focus on that instead of whether or not the decal process was on screen. But I am chipping them up with a hobby blade. It's important to use as sharp of a blade possible when chipping decals, that way you're only removing small portions of the decals instead of large flakes. And because I did chipping beforehand, I also had to try to match the decal chipping up with the paint chips. I should have chipped everything at once to make things easier, but I was pretty desperate to see if chipping the paint would fix things. While chipping the decals, I discovered a new way to achieve edge wear without working down to the metallics, something I couldn't really do with the previous chipping. As you see, this is accomplished with my hobby knife. A few videos ago, I talked about how I'm starting to condense chipping by only using tweezers, but it seems like the knife is making a comeback. And all I do for this is run the blade along the edges. Although this is quite simple, there are a few things to keep in mind. The first is how you scrape at the edges. I found that using the sides or back of the blade is gentle enough to only remove the white paint. And the other thing to keep in mind is how much you utilize this technique. It is very easy to overdo it, especially since I find this very satisfying. So to work around this, I don't expose an entire edge, but only bits and pieces of an edge. In my opinion, this makes the result more convincing. I sprayed a coat of semi-gloss and now I'm doing some repaints on the metallic surfaces. I'm stippling this on so when this paint dries, there will be a subtle difference in metallic tones. Now it's time for a pin wash. I'm using a gray color for this, which is actually my brown wash, but since I didn't shake up the bottle before use, it left me with the gray color instead. There are several ways of applying a wash, but because I want to be careful, I'm using a fine brush and applying this paint along all the engraved details. Me being this careful isn't because I want a clean result, I'm well past that point. Instead, it's because I'm working over white, where any spillage is very obvious. I found that the gray was pretty subtle, so I had to apply it twice, but I do prefer building an effect up rather than having it too heavy on the first go. I also found that the gray showed up on the orange, so I'm doing the same thing but on the orange parts. My theory is that as I used up more and more of the gray bit, the pigment got a little more concentrated, leaving me with a darker brownish gray. Moving the bottle around also could have stirred up the wash slightly as well, but I have no way of really telling. And on the gray and metallic parts, I had to use a black wash. The brown just didn't show up enough for it to be viable. I still felt things were too clean, so I'm adding a slight patina. This involves some speckling all over the model and then brushing everything down with a flat brush. This does raise a slight concern as vertical streaks usually occur due to gravity, but I've added an Earth Federation Space Force marking which makes for a bit of a contradiction. After all, there is no gravity in space. But until I can figure out a better way of doing things, this will be my method. I wanted a grayish brown, so I just used the brown wash unmixed, then shake the bottle so the wash is actually brown, and then I just mix the two. It sounds pretty weird and a little bit more complicated than it has to be, but it works. I also add some speckling with the gray wash. If some specks are too large for my taste, I just remove them by streaking downwards. It's the exact same as the patina, just with a different colored wash and with a localized cleanup instead of all over the model. When this is dry, I'll spray a coat of flat clear. I then do speckling with the gloss varnish to break up the finish and add more visual texture. Because the gloss is clear, the effect is very subtle. You'll only see the effect if you shine a light on the model, and it's only visible from certain angles as well. The last thing to do is paint and weather the weapons. This process is an extremely condensed version of the weathering I did on that Zaku. I paint and do a wash. This method of a wash is different from a pin wash in that I cover the entire surface with paint and remove the excess. This creates a result that is more messy, which I like. And when the wash is dry, I then chip. This happens after because I used black for the wash, which has the potential to cover up all the chips. It's also worth noting that I didn't do any intermediate clear coats. This saves time and creates a grungier look, which I do like. While this footage plays out, I figured I'd answer the question I posed at the beginning of the video. Do I think the Act Zaku is a real Zaku? Well, the Act Zaku isn't a Zaku, but it also is. You see, visually, there's no more similarities between it and a Zaku than, say, something like an Ifrit and a Zaku or a Goof and a Zaku, and those aren't Zakus. And while the Act Zaku was a development from the MS-06, the development isn't something as simple like a new backpack, but an entire overhaul. So the way I view the Act Zaku is that it's a mobile suit that's only a Zaku in name, and that isn't a bad thing. Real-world military vehicles have often taken the name of older vehicles despite being completely different machines. We also use the Zaku name to describe any sort of enemy grunt suit, and the word has evolved into this umbrella term to describe such units. So while a graze is a graze, it's also a Zaku, and the same can be said for this design. But with that, the project is done. As usual, this isn't me telling you what exactly to do when painting your Gunpla, but a look into my own process. If you liked the video, consider supporting the channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing. It's what justifies me spending all this money on kits. And I am curious about your thoughts. Is the Act Zaku really a Zaku? But anyways, thank you so much for watching, and I'll be seeing you in the next video, whenever that is.